I'm walking along the beach near Newcastle in County Down. Behind me is the spectacular backdrop of the Mourne Mountains, and to my left, the sand dunes of Murlough National Nature Reserve. Murlough has been owned and managed by the National Trust since 1967, and it was the first nature reserve to be established in Ireland. The sand dune system of which Murlough is a part stretches north from Newcastle round the shore of Dundrum Bay. The uses to which other parts of the dune system have been put include golf course, caravan site, farm, military training area and recreation area. Murlough is flanked on its northern and western sides by the tidal estuary of Dundrum Inner Bay. This shingle beach is part of what makes Murlough unique, even amongst sand dune systems in Northern Ireland. It's the last of a series of 14 or so parallel shingle ridges which form a foundation to the whole dune system. Wherever you dig down in the dunes, you get to shingle, and the lowest point of the sand dunes is about 30 feet above sea level. This means that it's a very dry sand dune system, and quite simply there are no other dry sand dune systems formed on shingle in the country. Where did the shingle come from? It consists of pebbles which have been rounded and smoothed by the sea, and it is basically geological material, ground up rocks, which were carried along in the ice cap during the last glaciation, dumped on the seabed when the ice melted, at a guess 10,000 years ago, and gradually worked by the sea into these parallel shingle ridges. A few plants managed to gain a foothold in this very hostile environment. There is no soil, there is constant wind, and plants have to be able to withstand drying salt spray. It was plants like these which began the job 5,000 years ago of building Murlough dunes by trapping the first few grains of wind-blown sand. If you walk along the beach on a windy day, you can feel your face being stung by grains of sand. Over time, wind-blown sand trapped by plants forms sand dunes. And the most important plant in this process is marram grass. Looking a bit more closely at this plant, it's got a smooth, shiny, waxy surface which is ideally suited to withstand constantly having grains of sand blown against it. It's got a long, hard, dead, pointed tip which is ideally suited for thrusting up through drifts of sand which have blown on top of it. And generally, the more mobile sand there is around, the happier marram grass is. It's capable of building sand dunes at a fairly considerable rate in windy conditions, as long as there is a good supply of blown sand from the beach. The dunes nearest the sea are known as foredunes. The hollows, or flat areas behind the foredunes, are called slacks. And it is in this more sheltered zone that a number of other plants start to colonize and stabilize the sand. These include rest harrow, wild thyme, viper's bugloss, and wild pansy. Birdsfoot trefoil is one of the plants which helps to improve the soil for others by fixing atmospheric nitrogen in it. Murlough is different from all other Irish dune systems in one important characteristic. The slacks are dry, with about 30 feet of shingle foundations before you reach the water table. In all other dune systems, the water table is much closer to the surface and the slacks are wet. The result of this is that the dry slacks at Murlough are characterized by a very unusual lichen community. Besides being unusual, this is also extremely fragile and is one of the reasons why the access to certain parts of the dunes has to be restricted. I mentioned soil just now, but it's still really only sand. Because the sand is partly made up of billions of crushed seashells, it is very rich in lime. Humus is added over time by rotting down plant material, and we've already seen how nitrogen is added. Gradually, as conditions improve, so more plants are able to move in. With time, another important change happens to the soil as you move inland and away from the influence of freshly blown sand. Over hundreds of years, falling rain dissolves and washes the lime content down and out of the soil. This process is known as leaching, and the result is that the soil becomes more acid in content. The colour of the soil changes from the familiar yellow of beach sand to darker shades of grey and brown. It becomes more suitable for heathland plants such as heather and whin, which prefer an acid soil. As you walk inland at Murlough, you can see this change gradually taking place as the lime-loving duneland plants give way to the more acid-loving heathland vegetation. The plant communities at Murlough have developed over centuries of human intervention. The Normans, who also built Dundrum Castle, introduced the rabbit to Murlough dunes, and hundreds of years of rabbit grazing have produced this characteristic short grazed turf rich in wild flowers. Things changed dramatically in the 1960s when the rabbits were almost wiped out by a disease introduced deliberately by man called myxomatosis. The rabbits on Murlough were never able to recover to the point where they could regain control of the vegetation. And this was the result. The invasion and spread of alien shrub species like sea buckthorn. Man, this time in the shape of the National Trust, intervened again, both to remove the sea buckthorn from selected areas and to restore the rabbit population. First, we brought in wild rabbits from other parts of the country and released them into vacant rabbit warrens. And then, in 1987, we brought in heavy reinforcements in the form of sheep, which now graze 400 acres of the dunes in winter. They eat back the vegetation to the point where the rabbits can regain control of it. All of these measures are part of the National Trust's programme of conservation management. So far we've looked at dune formation, succession and plant communities, wildlife, and we've considered conservation management. But conservation management is only part of the work of the National Trust in caring for these sand dunes. Because Murlough is next to a very popular beach and recreation area, the National Trust has to do an enormous amount of work to enable the dunes to withstand the sheer pressure of numbers of people that come here during the summer. This sand dune that I'm standing in front of is in a pretty bad state, because although marram grass does an excellent job of building the sand dunes and binding them together, it's not much good at being trampled on. And these dunes being where they are, next to this superb beach, they get tremendous human pressure. You can see where people have been climbing about here, wearing little channels up and down. breaking over the stems of the grass and in fact causing footpaths to form, which will end up as wind tunnels. The wind will simply whistle through here and blow all this sand away. This sand dune would very quickly blow away if we didn't do anything to protect it. We call it the jumping hill, and it's right in the middle of the most popular part of the dunes. And all through the summer it has children playing and sliding down it. Great fun. The marram grass, not surprisingly, doesn't stand a chance. So that as soon as the wind blows, all this loose sand just blows away. We have to resort to quite extensive artificial means to protect the dunes in these areas which get heavily worn by the public. It's not something we like doing because it looks unnatural. It looks really quite ugly if you have a feeling for what sand dunes should look like. But this area is, you could almost say, a sacrificial area which takes the public pressure and takes it off the other parts of the dunes which are protected by fences, protected for the benefit of the wildlife which lives in them. And we do this job by thatching. We call it thatching. What we do is we take cut branches of sea buckthorn, which happens to be a shrub which grows very extensively elsewhere on the dunes, and we lay them down on the areas of bare sand and peg them with wire. Now this does a double job. The thatching traps wind-blown sand, just like the marram grass does. It keeps people off the parts of the sand that we don't want them to be on, because the thorns are extremely sharp and unpleasant. And best of all, it protects the marram grass and other duneland plants which are able to grow up through it. In time, we're able to remove the wire because, with a bit of luck, the sand will have completely buried all of these unsightly thorns and the dune will have been mended. About 250,000 people come here in the course of the year, most of them crowded into the months of July and August. And all of those pairs of feet tramping their way from the car park down to the beach cause very serious wear and tear, because the sort of dune turf which occurs naturally just isn't able to withstand the pressure. It simply gets worn away and the bare sand starts to show and fairly soon starts to blow away. And this is where this comes in. This is an important part of our strategy for getting people from the road to the beach, causing the minimum of damage and wear and tear on the way. It's a timber footpath. It's made of slats of treated timber, Douglas fir, which are threaded together. You can't see the wire because it's buried, but every slat is threaded onto the next one with wire and staked off into the ground so that it can't be lifted, and it lasts for 30 years or so. It's expensive, but it gets the people from there to there without destroying the place on the way. Here we're back onto shingle again. This is a continuation of the shingle which we saw back on the beach and which runs away back under the dunes. But fairly soon we're back onto the timber footpath again, and that takes us all the way back to the road. Another important part of our strategy for dealing with people can be seen over there. There's an enormous area for people to enjoy, but it is most important that areas of the dunes are set aside and protected for the wildlife and the vegetation which occur in them. Therefore, we have a fence. And the fence runs right the way round, back from the beach to give people plenty of room, but nevertheless it's there so that the sort of wear and tear which is caused in the beach area cannot be continued back into the dunes. Well, the area behind me, you can see, is as flat as a billiard table. There's absolutely no growth of grass in it whatsoever. And this is caused, quite simply, by trampling. Endless feet scuffing away and keeping it short. Rabbits graze it as well, but there's precious little here for rabbits to get a bite on. And this really shows just how important the fence is. Because if we look away behind the smooth patch, you can see the fence, and the area beyond it, the vegetation is long and reasonably luxuriant. And the difference between the two sides of the fence is quite simply trampling. One side is trampled, the other isn't. We've looked at thatching, footpaths and fences. The first thing which people see when they arrive here is signs. And a look at this sign gives you some idea of the problems faced at a coastal dune system like this. Education is a very important part of the work of the nature reserve. And so that we can manage this resource in the best possible way, all educational groups are asked to contact the wardens well in advance before any intended visit. A leaflet setting out the facilities available and the National Trust's educational policy at Murlough can be obtained by writing to this address.